Welcome to Advent Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Well, thank you, Bill and Rachel, for being on with me today. We're going to be talking about the shepherds in the story. So we all love that part in the Christmas story when the angels appear to the shepherds and the heavenly host sings out. We have a bunch of songs written about that moment. First of all, what do we know about shepherds? Not many people in our congregation are going to be familiar with shepherding. What do you know about shepherds?
I mean, I'll be honest, I just think of someone wearing a robe with some sort of cane and just kind of moving the animals around, which I know that's a lot more than that. That is a very probably childlike look on it. But it is, yeah, it is someone that takes care of the animals and guides them and keeps them safe from, because I don't think a lot of people, had a bunch of gates and, cordoned off areas and electric fences. So they really needed someone that could guide the animals and teach them.
Shepherds, I did a little bit of researching, but shepherds had to work hard. There's kind of some danger. There's wild animals out there that can come after the sheep, and sheep are kind of peaceful and submissive and trusting, and really depend on kind of the shepherds really kind of develop and get to know their sheep really by recognition, and they have to find food and green pastures and water for the sheep to eat. And then they protect them and probably have some place to put them at night. So there's a protective role that they've got to play. That would seem like a lot of work to me.
Yeah, a few weeks ago when I preached a sermon on shepherds and shepherding, I think it was Noel Kessline talked about how at night they would get all the sheep to go into a cave, and there was usually a gate at the entrance of the cave that was just wide enough for a single sheep kind of to fit through. And they would have each sheep go through the gate between their legs, and they would feel the whole body of the sheep as they went through for any injuries or health problems, and just this very intimate image of the shepherd with the sheep.
Yeah.
I've also learned, and I shared this, we had some of the lost boys of the Sudan at my college, and one of them had become the student body president and he had been a shepherd, and talked about that experience and just the courage and the bravery that it takes to be a shepherd, because part of your role is to put yourself between your sheep and whatever is predator. Jesus uses shepherding imagery a lot. What are some of the things that he will say about shepherds in his ministry?
He calls Israel lost sheep, the people without a shepherd. Kind of lifts up that imagery of people kind of not knowing where they're going, really. He talks about willing to give up his life for his sheep, which is we talked about that earlier in terms of shepherds being the protector between danger and the sheep. He also talks about feeding and sheep. He feeds his sheep with the feeding, the meals, the big meals he does with the huge crowds, but also uses that image when he is passing on his ministry to Peter, to the disciples. Feed my sheep. Will you feed my sheep? He uses that imagery several times at the end of his ministry, and as he's looking to the future with his disciples in the future.
I think what's underlying in a lot, of those scriptures is something very powerful to me. It's the need for a shepherd. He identifies that there is a great need in all of us, for him to guide us, keep us safe, lead us, and that we can entrust him to do what needs to be done, just like the sheep did. And shepherds can be involved with like 1,000 sheep or something, if I remember correctly. I mean, think of that. And compared to what Jesus is dealing with, that's a lot of people to try to keep in check. And I think that gives me a sense of comfort, is knowing that we all need that. And that brings us back to that humble place of, we're not our own shepherd. That's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I think about Jesus calling himself the Good Shepherd and telling that parable of the Good Shepherd, the shepherd that knows each sheep by name, the one who goes after the lost sheep, who leaves the whole, flock of, lots and lots of sheep and goes after the one that's lost. And of course, that's been picked up in so many paintings and images, Jesus carrying the sheep. But also Jesus calls himself, and many since have called him, the Lamb of God. And so there's a sense of both. He's both sheep and shepherd.
It's interesting, the 23rd Psalm, well, of course, put together by David, more or less, another shepherd. I know we're going to talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, so that's a great segue. Tell me about the famous figures and characters in the Hebrew scriptures who were shepherds. And you mentioned the 23rd Psalm, which might not be a character, but it's a very comforting passage that a lot of us know.
Could have been composed by David, a shepherd, who was certainly a major character in the Old Testament. There's Abraham. I saw this list. I'm cheating.
That's all right. Cheat away.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's sons, Moses, David, even Abel back in the beginning. All were shepherds taking care of animals. So at least that's a good start. Rachel, you can pick it up from there.
Honestly, I feel like you just listed the ones that I had found. So, yes, Moses, of course, sticks out to me. The strong visuals with him, guiding, and now people.
Yeah, he starts out shepherding his father-in-law's sheep, and that's when he has his burning bush experience. Meets God in the burning bush, and then ends up shepherding the Hebrew people out of slavery and into liberation, and through being lost and wandering in the wilderness, and finally reaching the promised land. And then, of course, there's David, which there's so many different stories about David, but that's one of the early ones. Is prophets sent to anoint the new king, and knows that it's one of Jesse's sons, and lines all Jesse's sons up, and none of them are the one that's called. And well, where is the one that's called? Well, he's out shepherding. The youngest and smallest of all of them is out shepherding, and then of course David goes up against Goliath, and that's where we really see, probably more than anywhere in the scriptures, the courage of a shepherd, one who's just willing to face down the foes that seem insurmountable to everyone else. Anything else you want to say about the Hebrew scriptures and shepherds?
It was interesting. I was just going to say something maybe about some of the Psalms. If David is a musician too, as a shepherd, you could imagine some lonely, quiet times, maybe at night when the sheep are all asleep, or just where you're out and reflecting out in the nature. And I think we're going to talk about that in a minute, but too, it's a powerful place to really be reflective and meditative and encounter God. And you just mentioned Moses and the burning bush, encountering God out there, out in the fields.
Yeah, the places where shepherds hang out are the exposed places, the places where there's no barrier between them and the elements, or them and God. And certainly that's what we find with Moses and the the burning bush encounter, but also, exposed to dangers too. I think about, and I mentioned this in one of the other segments, Joseph, Jacob's son, goes out to find his brothers who are out shepherding, and that's when they toss him in a hole and sell him into slavery and almost kill him. It's out in those exposed places where those kind of experiences, both the horrific and the beautiful, seem to happen. Well, do you hear echoes of any of those shepherd stories from the Hebrew scriptures in the Christmas story?
Well, the word that comes up to me, and it won't leave me alone, is sojourn. I keep thinking of that. And I know that maybe at times a lot of shepherds were staying into a smaller area, but I think of really how vulnerable and yet strong their position is. Like, you really are one human with many, many animals, dealing with, like we said, the elements, other people, other landowners, creatures, and yet you are relied upon, because sheep do typically, as we've learned, do blindly follow, so to say, or follow really, maybe that's not what I meant to say, but follow more in trust. They kind of just go where they need to go.
And I guess we were talking about too the being out there, out in creation, out in the world, is where God encounters us, and that's where the angels came down and spoke to that group of shepherds. It's a very interesting symbolic connection that the angels would come to shepherds. That's right. A theme throughout the scriptures, and say, here it is, here's Jesus, and you just go see him, get into time. It's really special. It's a big deal. And of course that was scary. I mean, that was a big show out there in the wilderness. I keep using the word wilderness. It's not probably the right word, but
yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think of the Christmas story mentions David over and over, that Jesus is coming out of that lineage of David. And I think about David, this shepherd with nothing but a slingshot, going up against the giant. And here in the Christmas story, we're going to have a giant presented right away, Herod first. And then Jesus is going to go up against a lot of other giants over the course of his ministry. I think we do get this kind of foreshadowing of what his life and his ministry is going to be about, and the kind of courage that it's going to take. The angels who appear to the shepherds, they tell them right away, fear not. Now, are shepherds usually fearful people?
I certainly don't think so.
Yeah, I don't either. Everything we've said about them, what their task was, their protectiveness, their presence with the sheep. I don't see them as scared people.
So what do you think that command, fear not, is about then, if they're not fearful people?
It's easy to say, if I were out in the middle of nature like that, and there was this sudden music and angels floating around, and that would be, whoa, that's not my normal experience out here. I would be scared. What in the world's going on?
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's also my thought as well, is that especially if we look at how angels are described in the Bible, that is not your average thing that you'd be seeing every day. And then, you get used to, regardless of how much shepherds have to deal with, the elements and, changes around them, you kind of get used to what you might run into that can be dangers or something new or different. But that certainly, I think, would put even the bravest person a little bit in a state of shock. So I think it's meant as a comfort to them.
Mm-hmm. Running into God out there in that more visible kind of way is is very powerful, would be very powerful.
Yeah, I think it maybe highlights how powerful and kind of awe-inspiring God, or even God's messengers, are, that these shepherds who aren't fearful, who are willing to put themselves in front of all sorts of predators, that in the presence of God, in the presence of these messengers, suddenly find themselves afraid. Well, why was it important? The first called followers of Jesus are people who run toward danger and not away from it. Right? The shepherds are the first ones kind of sent to that that manger scene to go follow and encounter the Christ child. Why is it important that they would run toward danger and not away?
It was a dangerous call they were receiving. We tend to not see it in that context, but shoot, their leader was crucified. And his ministry brought him in conflict with Rome and with the religious and political leaders in his own nation, who were doing everything they could to protect their own place. So they were being called to a very dangerous ministry, life.
Yeah.
Not an easy one to.
Yeah, Jesus, didn't shy away from the dangerous and move toward it and through it, and following his way really requires Jesus followers to also be willing to move toward what is dangerous, what most of us, if we're not following that way, would otherwise avoid.
Yes, my thought, I kept thinking about the bystander effect. As that, if you were one of these shepherds, there was no option to do that. You couldn't wait and hem and haw and stand back. Well, someone else will take care of it. As God's people, we have to be ready to face difficulties, challenges, the good, bad, and the ugly, really. Whatever that means to us, we have to be ready to look at it and have an unflinching view of things sometimes. So
if the sheep need us, we have to be ready to jump in and
right,
take care, meet their needs, as well as recognize that we're sheep too, and
right.
we will be cared for.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful conversation on the shepherds, one of the many characters in the Nativity story. Thank you for joining us for Advent Conversations as we continue on the journey of this season.